Yes, there you are. There you are. Thank you. Over to you, Anna, now. Yeah. Yes.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Hannah Grossman. I am a learning and development specialist at the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress in the United States. So while I do have my PhD and I am in higher ed, I am a practitioner more than I am a professor. So today I'm going to be sharing about collaborative experiential learning and how I use collaborative experiential learning to help groups of learners really explore complexity. Now, a big part of the reason I need to have learners explore complexity is because the work I'm doing is to train mental health professionals in child traumatic stress. Actually, let's keep myself aligned with my discussion points by bringing up my visuals. So as I go through this talk, I am mentioning that I am at the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress, and the work I'm going to discuss does intersect with my work at the National Center, and it was derived from my work at the National Center. So I want to thank the National Center for funding me through this. And I add a disclaimer that for putting my slides together, I did use ChatGPT, and I have used AI to support me in my putting my words together. I hope that's acceptable to everyone. Okay, so today we're going to go through what is collaborative experiential learning, the role of cognitive load in collaborative experiential learning, the integration of social emotional loads, how we use instructional tools and guiding questions to make these really deep, complex learning goals accessible, and how we apply these to real-world problems. First, let me begin by just giving you an idea of what collaborative experiential learning is. Collaborative experiential learning is a group learning situation structured using the experiential learning cycle. The experiential learning cycle by Code 2014 involves having an experience, communicating about the results and observations, processing with discussion, analysis, and reflection, generalizing to connect to real-world experiences, and applying to future practice. In the mental health and behavioral health training that we do at the National Center, we use example cases that involve children and families who are going through hard situations as our experience that our learners are sharing together, is reading through sections of the cases or watching a video about a section of a case. We then support our learners in collaboratively thinking and observing results, talking about what they see, digging deep with discussion and analysis, and then really thinking about how that applies back to their real world. When you're thinking about children and family who've experienced trauma, you want the professionals that are supporting them to really be good at their job, because each time when they're not good at their job, they could be harming these children more than they were already harmed. So by really getting the opportunity in the training situation to work through the complexity associated with the interpersonal nature and interactional nature of these complex dynamics, it allows these professionals to support the children and the families they do see in person with a lot less fear of harm. So in my work setting, the pedagogical approach matters a lot in terms of reducing harm and complexity. So that's how this approach came about. And anytime you have questions about anything, feel free to come off mic and ask them or put them in the chat. We are a small enough group that I can directly kind of interact with questions and thoughts and ideas. So now, collaborative experiential learning. One of the difficulties about experiential learning around this amount of complexity is pure discovery learning is hard. And it's hard to make sure you're getting at the exact learning objectives you want your learners to get at. When your goal is familiarity with the subject matter, the learning objectives might not be that intense, but when your learning objectives are specifically necessary for diagnosing a problem, intervening in how that is solved, working with systems that provide people resources, you want to make sure that the training allows you to get to those learning objectives because they make a huge professional difference in your competency. So how do we make these really complex learning objectives available in this collaborative experiential learning approach? Now that's really related to cognitive science and cognitive load. So collaborative experiential learning is embedded in a cognitive load framework. Are we familiar with cognitive load as a group? Could you give me a thumbs up if cognitive load's a familiar topic to you? Okay, so only a little bit. Cognitive load is really about the work and the effort it requires to process information, make decisions, and solve problems. Some decisions require a lot of effort. Others only require a little. For example, if I'm just being asked to listen to a story, the work of listening to a story and hearing it and seeing if I like it is a lot less than if I'm asked to make a critical decision about something in that story. If I have to make a critical decision, I've got to weigh the options, I've got to compare and contrast. That's a lot more work. Now, what we know about cognitive load is that for each person, cognitive load is finite. You are only going to have a certain amount of processing power. Now, a person's processing power does have some reliability in them, but it does fluctuate by times of day, by what they're interacting with and their interest in it and things like that. While the exact measuring of cognitive load would be really difficult in this, estimating of the amount of work and keeping that work under a certain amount is a lot more manageable with a cognitive load framework in pedagogy. So when I'm using a cognitive load framework in teaching, the goal is that I want to have the intrinsic load of the task, the work that's going to be associated with that task because that's what you have to do. I want that manageable for any given load. I want extraneous load, that load that's confusion, uncertainty, distraction, reduced as much as possible. And I want to support germane processing, which is connecting ideas, using prior knowledge to build future understandings, putting that information together and collaborating together about how that information makes sense together. So for every participant throughout every task, they are individually balancing their intrinsic load of the task and their germane processing with the extraneous processing to do the best learning they can in that situation. Now that gets even more complex and even more complicated when you add in a collaborative idea to cognitive load, because then it's not just, hey, the intrinsic load of the task, but also the intrinsic load of the communication around the task, the coordination necessary to getting group members sharing and communicating about what they're doing, the comparing and contrasting different ideas, even the emotional dynamics of the learning. If you're not managing these cognitive demands well, your learners are going to not be as successful as they could be. The collaboration might become counterproductive. You might not get the results you want. You might not be able to dive into the learning objectives you want. You could actually get cognitive overload, frustration, and a feeling of hopelessness from your learner. Now, these things are exceedingly counterproductive with your learning objectives most of the time, especially when those learning objectives are related to behavioral health and wellness. So, big picture of this slide, everything in the collaborative experiential learning framework is about balancing cognitive load, and each person is doing it individually. There's enough variation between people that I personally do not see a lot of benefit in estimating cognitive load. For measuring cognitive load, I see more benefit in estimating it and keeping it below a cutoff for a learning task. Okay. So I'm taking this cognitive load framework a little deeper, and I'm talking about work especially associated with collaboration. These are cognitive loads that are intrinsic to a collaborative task. If they are not managed well, the collaboration will not be as successful. This is based on a model by Jansen, Kirshner, Erickson, Kirshner, and Pass from 2010. I did add a category to it that I will explain as I go. So when we're talking about collaborative cognitive loads, there are a number of different pieces of work associated with collaboration that it's helpful to think about. I'm going to explain the load and why it needs to be thought about. Then I'm going to talk about how I use support strategies for that load within collaborative experiential learning. So the first load I want to bring up in this is the load of sharing. If we're all discussing the same subject matter and we are sharing our ideas, knowing when to share is part of that load. Knowing the format to share in is part of that load. Knowing how to take turns with sharing is part of that load. In order to make that load more manageable, I like to provide collaborative guidelines in a process to make it clearer how we would like to be sharing in the group, both in terms of the types of information and the social emotional norms around sharing. Second, I like to create a focus on psychological safety in sharing. The idea that if I share information, there will not be undue repercussions from my choosing to share that information. Also, I like to explicitly incorporate social emotional goals as learning goals and learning outcomes of training. So at the very beginning, both the learning participants and the learning facilitators understand that the learning experience is not just content information, but also social emotional skills and strategies that are important for these complex interpersonal human-centered problems. And these sharing support strategies make our collaborative sharing easier, more manageable, and more powerful, and it feels more supported. The second cognitive load of collaborative processing I'd like to discuss is the cognitive load of a shared understanding. The shared understanding is almost a metaphysical space where you are collaboratively sitting and problem solving together. This includes an understanding of what your goals are. This includes a real understanding of the context and the environment that your goals are being met in. It involves a understanding of roles and how people are going to be interacting in there. If you have a weak shared understanding, people might be talking about things that aren't overlapping or don't relate well to each other. That's a good sign that your shared understanding isn't as strong as you'd like. A sign of a good shared understanding would be everyone knows what you're trying to address with a question. Everyone knows what they're comparing, what they're looking at. Everyone understands that what you're trying to do. So in our curriculum, we use a storytelling format to build a strong shared understanding. Stories in general are really awesome for building shared understandings because humans are natural storytellers and we learn very easily from storytelling. It was one of our earliest methods of sharing complex information. And a story can be a really, really complex metaphor with lots of interesting connection points that can be easily turned or twisted or adjusted to change viewpoints. And it changes so many factors at the same time that it makes creating a shared understanding very interesting and very powerful. I really love storytelling formats as a collaborative experiential learning approach because they provide such rich metaphor that they allow a depth of learning in complexity that very few other approaches can provide. Now, the third category I'm going to go into on cognitive loads of collaborative processes is the loads of comparing and contrasting. This is a category I added to Jensen, Kirshner, Erickson, Kirshner, Pass's model. And that's with the recognition that when you're putting together information in community and you have different people with different perspectives, when you're combining those perspectives and comparing and contrasting them against each other to determine your own view, the way that information is organized can make that comparing and contrasting easier or more difficult. The easiest place I find to see this difficulty and this complexity is thinking about map reading. Put yourself back in your head to a time when you went to a place and you saw a map on a wall. Now that map can be oriented in a number of directions. If that map was oriented so the place that you were in and the direction you were facing were aligned with each other, it is much easier to determine what way to turn than if you are looking at the map and the map is aligned in a different direction. If the map is turned over from the direction you're facing and what you're looking at, you have to translate each and every move from left to right and back to forward each time you think about it. And that work is much, much more difficult. So when you're collaboratively combining ideas and putting them together, the work of orienting them together can actually change how hard that is and that collaboration can be. So to support that work in collaborative experiential learning, we incorporate discussion questions, graphic organizers, and intentional conceptual lens exploration. So we'll ask people to put on different conceptual lenses to look at different things and compare it to another conceptual lens as a way of orienting them to the conceptual lenses. Now, the fourth collaborative process load is the load of remembering. It's making sure that the right information that pops into your head to share at a time is actually connected to what you want to be sharing at, and you can remember the information that you find valuable at the time you need to use it. Now, to support remembering, we make sure we have a very coherent structure. We give categorizing charts and categorizing domains to support remembering information that fits in those domains. We have didactic slides. We have priming, and we have prompting. So when I'm saying didactic slides, I will give you maybe 3 minutes of didactic information. For example, a chart categorizing preschool children's reactions, school-age children reactions, adolescent and high school student reactions, with each kind of reaction listed as a didactic slide. That also works as a primer to prime them to look for those things in the future. A question can also be a primer to get them thinking in a domain they weren't already thinking in. For example, how might your caregivers be affected by this? Might prime the caregiving category. That second one was a prompt as well. So we started with, hey, collaborative experiential learning is based in cognitive load. We went to collaborative load. But collaborative experiential learning has another cognitive load feature that is unique in a cognitive load model, and that is emotional load components. Collaborative experiential learning recognizes that when you collaborate with other people, it is not just a cognitive endeavor. It is also a social emotional endeavor. And social emotional loads with humans being as social creatures as we are, social emotional loads are often the primary cognitive loads we attend to. When we are dysregulated because we have been harmed, it is much harder for us to focus on answering a math question because our attention is going to be going toward dysregulation. Those are the ones that are very impactful for us. So in this collaborative experiential learning approach, we're looking at collaborative loads, but we are also looking at emotional cognitive loads. Now, emotion can play a number of different roles in the cognitive load framework. When I was talking about being dysregulated and being unable to do the math problem, like someone who has test anxiety, for example, that's emotion playing a role as an extraneous cognitive load. It detracts the learner from their ability to focus on the learning task by taking the cognitive resources for the learning and using them to focus on being dysregulated. So, collaborative experiential learning is embedded in creating safety and respect and dignity in ways to mitigate the chance that learners will have negative emotional states, to increase the learning in the learning situation. A second impact of emotional load is how emotion shapes memory. So that cognitive load of remembering in the collaborative load, they find if you prompt people with negative, they will remember more negative. If you prompt with positive, they will remember more positive. And the way that you prompt and the way you prime can really affect your learning state-dependent memory fits here as well. Also, just using positive emotional states can enhance your memory retention and retrieval. Being aware and being positive can make it easier to remember. So that's another impact of emotional load. A third impact of emotional load that is critical in my work is emotional load as intrinsic cognitive load. So in our shared understanding and in our sharing, I'm sharing and working on problems related to child trauma. These are children who are hurting, and their providers need to be able to deal with traumatogenic information as work requirements. Their ability to stay well with this harm in their world are professional competencies I need to support them in developing. For this reason, we always think about the level of traumatogenic material we're incorporating in a training. Is it appropriate for the audience? Is it realistic in terms of their professional development? Are we giving people enough places for reflection and incorporating that traumatogenic material so that we are acknowledging and respecting the intrinsic load that traumatogenic material is bringing to the collaboration? Are we giving the time to incorporate people's emotional responses as part of our training planning? These are all important emotional load components I'm incorporating in this collaborative experiential learning. And finally, emotion affecting motivation. Negative emotions demotivate learners. And if we can build our learning experience right, if we can build health and wellness into the learning experience and design our learning experience so that when our learners leave our learning experience, they're actually leaving it more excited and more energized than when they got in there, that information they left with will end up being applied more in their world, will end up being more used. And so the better you can incorporate thinking about the ramifications of a positive emotional experience in the learning, the better your learning objectives will actually be reached, especially if they include transfer to a future learning experience. Okay, so I think I'm about to move from my really theoretical materials to more of the experiential place. And I think that this is a really good time to pause and talk about questions first.
Thank you, Hannah. So you mentioned something like dramagenic material, but I'm not sure what this means. So can you just elaborate on this?
Sure.
Because
Sorry about that. Traumatogenic material is material that evokes a trauma response in people. Because humans have an empathy response to other people, when we hear about people in pain and hurting, that can cause a negative emotional response in us. Now, I am training psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists how to help children who have had negative experiences. They need to be able to hear about negative experiences and still remain balanced and emotionally regulated and well. So when I talk about traumatogenic material, it's material that is likely to dysregulate a person, make them have a negative emotional reaction. And I'm having to train people how to take that kind of material and be able to rebalance themselves when dealing with that type of material as part of the learning experience, not just learning the theories that they're going to be applying, but the emotional regulation behind the application as well. Does that make more sense?
yes, I hope you can bear with me for some like what from what you're thinking, I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of someone who's not really into like psychological backgrounds, or his background isn't not in directly linked to higher ed. So how can we make sure that they understand applying the sort of collaborative experiential learning into their own sort of teaching and learning context without feeling like it's too abstract for them? And yes, we still haven't really mentioned and gotten to the part about experiential learning, but from just the theoretical part of it, how can we make sure that everyone can just draw out information from this theory and make it like tailored to their own background?
So I think that's going to be best shared as we do move into the next part, where we are actually playing around with experiencing some of it. And hopefully that will show how it's experiential and show how these pieces go in together. Okay? So.
All right, thank you.
Okay. I'm going to, I think, skip a few slides. And I might go back to those slides as we go. So I'm going to take us through as if we were doing a collaborative experiential learning training together. I will also point out the parts of it that are shaped by the collaborative experiential learning. When I'm leading a training in collaborative experiential learning, I begin by setting our training goals. I begin by welcoming people to our training and mentioning that we are asking for psychological safety and secondary traumatic stress practice in our training. This is the slide that I would read to a training. Core curriculum material may contain details that can act as trauma reminders, triggers for learners, especially learners with lived direct traumatic exposure. If you experience a trauma response during the delivery of case material, it's important to pay attention to the severity of these personal reactions. Please notify your facilitator if you have concerns about further participation. Core Concept 12. In addition to direct exposure, secondary traumatic stress is the emotional duress that results from interacting with the firsthand trauma experiences of another person. It is important to understand signs of STS, realize how influential it is, and consider how it impacts your own well-being and your work in the helping profession. Core curriculum trainings strive to provide a safe environment for learners to explore their own STS responses and direct trauma cues, as well as practice self-regulation skills. These skills are best developed and practiced in a safe learning environment to better prepare for real-world situations. So if you listen to what this slide is framing, how this slide is framing this information, we are setting our learning outcomes with our participants at the very beginning as your well-being and your psychological safety in this learning experience is important. It's fundamental enough we discuss it at the beginning. That's one of the key parts of making people realize the importance of emotional load, is acknowledging it as a community and setting it as a direct learning objective. In this end section here, we are setting our learning objectives as exploring your own secondary traumatic stress responses, exploring your own direct trauma cues, and practicing self-regulation. Now, people who are not into psychology might not need to be doing the self-regulation on that level. They might have their emotional learning outcomes be about connecting ideas together, or be about supporting other people's sharing of ideas. But in this case, it's about explicitly setting emotional outcomes of the learning experience. Similarly, we use this integrative trauma and healing framework to create collaborative guidelines for our tools and discussions. Now, the integrative trauma and healing framework was created by, actually, no, I don't have the slide right there. It was created by Teddy McGinn and Leslie Briner in 2014. It basically says that anytime a person has a harmful violation of their safety, agency, dignity, and/or belonging, that can be experienced by that person as a trauma. And anytime you do anything to build their safety, agency, dignity, and/or belonging, that can help support that person on a path to wellness. And if you think about that, anytime you build safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, you are reducing the chance of having a harmful violation of an emotional load that will distract your learners from learning. So anytime you focus your learners on building safety, agency, dignity, and belonging, you reduce the chance of negative emotional loads. So I'm intentionally setting guidelines and sharing guidelines about creating safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. So safety, our group climate guidelines are to respect the group's privacy and confidentiality, to address conflict as it arises, to create a climate of vulnerability and bravery in sharing. The agency is to normalize questioning the unknown and speaking in rough draft, to provide places and spaces for participants' voices, to collaboratively identify and mitigate barriers to contribution and participation. To dignity, we use kindness and respect, even in disagreement. We work on being generous in our interpretation of others' perspectives. We attempt to reframe to a positive. We respect vulnerability and bravery in sharing. And finally, to support people's belonging, we practice active listening and participation. We show appreciation for people's contributions. We pay attention to relationships and feelings, and we create pathways for contribution and resource sharing. So these collaborative guidelines are intentional building of the emotional load support that we are trying to incorporate in our collaborative experiential learning to manage that emotional load and keep it able to be balanced. So when I was talking about giving support and didactic tools to support the process of a shared understanding, this is one of our didactic tools that allow you to support shared understanding and comparing and contrasting. It talks about children and youth being not singular entities, they're embedded in their families, their schools, their communities, and societies. They have factors on all of these levels that can either support these youths or add more challenges and barriers for them. By identifying possible important factors in the physical environment, you're better able to identify ways to improve the learning setting. So if you look at this description, it's a very short overview of an ecological model. It is not me sitting here talking for a long period of time. This me directly talking is really uncomfortable for me because when I facilitate, I usually facilitate much more back and forth collaboratively, only using little pieces of the information. So this helps create that shared understanding. It's the framing information for that shared understanding. And it's telling you about the information you want to compare and contrast. These important factors in the physical environment are what you're wanting to compare and contrast. And it's going to help support you in identifying those. So in our collaborative experiential learning, we have case material we read through and reason through together. I'm unsure that this will work with as few people as we have, but I'm going to try to do this. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it's okay. So we would read through this section out loud together, usually. Irene, can I ask you to support me by helping read through out loud, just so that I'm not the only voice talking?
Before I read, there was a question or an input by Dixon who had to leave. And she said, would love to hear more on pedagogical applications of this framework to curriculum designing and classroom instruction. But then she said she had to go. So that's what she said, but perhaps that comes later.
I mean, with as few people as we have, we could actually change to that instead of trying to experience it with as few people. Would that be preferred?
Perhaps that depends on what process you had in mind, but yes, that perhaps would be good to have.
Yeah. And if we can have people come on camera just so that I can get the interaction enough that we can kind of tailor this for the three of you, just because it'll make it much easier to adapt and move around as we do that. So in this section, I took a story that represented the interactions I wanted people to have. And then I had them use this tool to identify aspects that were related to the child that were dangerous, that were related to the caregivers that were dangerous, that were related to the community that were dangerous, that were related to the society that were dangerous. I also identified factors related to the child, caregivers, community, and society that are supportive. So in this example, it took case examples. There was a rich description of complexity in the field, and it has the learners collaboratively working together to identify the important factors in that section. So if you were, for example, a science teacher trying to use collaborative experiential learning in biology to teach about ecology, you might have the description of your environment as the written section. And then you might have on one side predators and on one side prey on different levels of the ecosystem as the different categories you were trying to break things down in to support your learners in thinking through their categorization, their comparing and their contrasting, and also to help them combine their information. Because the neat things about these heuristic tools that help you organize information is when one person is talking and another person is thinking, that cognitive load can mean they're not listening as well. But when I'm writing information in the tool so people can look at it and refresh that information, it means remembering that information is easier and it supports people in thinking and remembering through it, for example. So that is one of the examples of how it could be used for a pedagogical approach for a classroom instruction in a biology classroom, because I used to be a biology teacher. Now, if we were doing this with this section, you can see that this section has a lot of complexity around family interaction. This was written for a North American audience in the United States. Irene, can I have you read it out loud? Are you willing to?
I could attempt, although I have issues with a lot of things. Let me see if I can read.
I'll read it out loud.
Yeah, because of a few seeing things. Okay, Cynthia, Alex, and Karina were best friends. They had been friends ever since 3rd grade, when Alex's family moved to the area. The apartments were all in the same large, low-income housing complex a mile from a middle school. Alex, more formally Alejandrina, but teachers could never pronounce, you see, never pronounce it, was a few months younger than the other two, and they treated her like their little sister. She played the part too. She wore neat tailored clothing, had her hair in tight braids, and spoke with a laughing accent from her childhood in Oaxaca. Her parents were strict. They kept her busy caring for her younger brothers and never allowed her to miss Sunday morning church. Alex was their voice of reason, always worried about how things would be seen.
I'm going to stop you there,
okay,
and we'll just use Alex, just because it's easier that way. Thank you so much, Irene. I really appreciate that. So in this process, if we're thinking about the supportive factors for the child, if we were looking at Alex, that child, something that might be supportive is that her parents were very busy caring for her, and they cared about her a lot. They made sure she attended church, and they cared about her moral upbringing. That might be something we would mark down under supportive. Under risk factors, it might be that
I have a concern about the church bit. I think church should never be considered as supportive because sometimes, especially where we grow up with, we are forced to go to church. So I don't know. For some people, it would be a risk factor, and for some people, it would be supportive. Yeah. Thanks, Anna.
No, that's exactly what I was hoping you would do, because that's what collaborative experiential learning is about. Is if I say something's a risk factor and you don't believe it's a risk factor, you believe it's supportive in other ways, we discuss it and we combine perspectives. And the learning can be put in one box or the other. And for some people, it could be one. For some people, it could be the other. And for some people, it could be both. And you might end up having the exact same factor on different sides of the same level. It might be supportive for parents, but a risk factor for child. It might be supportive in the community, but harmful on the family level. This kind of complexity is brought out by having the graphic organizers that allow the spaces for these and the conversation around it. So, this would be a discussion question that might come after the doing of the protective shields map. The protective shields map would be done for about 10 or 15 minutes, collecting all of the factors we could, seeing how many categories we could fill and how we'd fill them. Now, this discussion question takes the complexity you've put in that map and makes you think about how you're combining that complexity. So Irene's comment about whether it's a risk or supportive factor with church is directly related to different cultural understandings and how our cultural understandings are shaping our perspectives and opinions. Now, in order to learn about this kind of social emotional complexity, we need to be able to dive into complexities around cultural understanding and cultural interaction. Having discussion questions that give us a place to create the shared understanding that's really deep and compare and contrast, and then reapply thinking about our own cultural understandings on this after we've had that discussion. This will help us reapply to our real world in that experiential learning. So what different things like cultural understandings might influence our labeling? So our own experience with church might be experiencing our label as risk or supportive factors. Our ability to, the way our state believes, incorporates religion might affect our cultural understandings on that. How families interact with schools might affect our cultural understanding. So this is a place to support people bringing in their own identities into their reasoning, because we know that identities affect how we apply our reasoning. I'm sorry this is feeling kind of fragmented. I've had to switch things up a whole bunch.
No worries, no worries.
So I think I'm gonna stop share here and ask what questions there might be or which ways I might want to redirect this. Because it's only the three of us. I don't think we want to record anymore because I feel like I gave an overview. And so with the smaller group and just having Irene and I here, we decided that the overview we did was enough of an overview that we understand some of the basics of how collaborative experiential learning is based in cognitive load. If you want to use collaborative experiential learning for guiding a learning situation you're creating, what you really need to do is first identify who your audience is, identify your learning goals that you want the learners to walk away from the learning experience with. That includes both social emotional goals and cognitive goals. Then you get an example. So you either create an example or you find an example that shares that complexity of those goals with rich points for discussion. You have your learners process through the example. You support them both social emotionally as they discuss through it and cognitively as they work through it by breaking it into pieces and segments, by giving people categories to support thinking conceptually, and by using memory offloading by time and space using visual tools or time-based tools. Then you use discussion questions to dig into the complexity that you uncover in your analysis and reflect on reapplication into the real world. You're making sure you break these learning objectives down enough so you're dealing with one bit of complexity at a time and cover each type of complexity until you're done. So this is how I would design a training or a lesson using collaborative experiential learning. Please feel free to reach out to me to find out more about it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Anna, for your session. We look forward to part 2 of it, and perhaps we can have time to practice more of what you've shared with us today. So thank you so much for your time and for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.